Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for a night of true horror stories that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. Tonight, I have 6 stories submitted by listeners just like you. Stories of average people simply living their lives when something dark reached them. Following these stories comes an update to a mysterious disappearance that we've all been waiting decades to unravel. And finally, to close out the night comes a fictional narrative submitted to us by an anonymous listener. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. It was the year 2000. Summer was coming to an end, and a new school year was fast approaching. My friend and I, both 8-year-old girls at the time, decided to enjoy one of the last days of summer riding our bikes around the neighborhood. We lived in a small Midwestern town, around 1 square mile in size. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and crime is virtually unheard of. It was the first year we were allowed to ride our bikes around the block without supervision, and we were ecstatic about our newfound independence. It's important to describe the layout of our block. 3 sides of the block were lined with houses, and the 4th side opposite our homes contained the town's historic railroad. While still operational, the tracks and depot sat empty for much of the year, only running for holidays and special events. Being a weekday afternoon in late August, this side of the block was exceptionally quiet. We had circled the block 6 times or so already, and were having the time of our lives. As we pedaled down the street alongside the train station again, an old beat-up pickup truck passed us, going the opposite direction, with a gruff-looking man behind the wheel. While it was unusual to see any traffic on this road, it did connect to other neighborhoods, so it was by no means alarming. When the man reached the end of the road, he turned his pickup around, this time turning to look at us as he passed by. That was a bit strange, but we figured maybe he had just missed his turn. However, when he turned around yet again at the other end of the road, it was clear he was up to something. When he passed us by the 3rd time, he glared at us and began to slow down, pulling his truck closer to our side of the street. Without a word, my friend and I looked at each other and immediately took off, cutting through neighbors' yards to reach the opposite side of the block as quickly as possible. As we ran, we heard the truck's tires squeal as the man fled. When we reached my driveway, we dumped our bikes and ran inside my house, yelling to my parents about what had just occurred. My dad asked for a description of the man and his truck, and immediately took off to look for him. The man was nowhere to be found, and my friend and her bike were safely taken home. We never saw that man or his truck again, and he was never identified. Needless to say, my friend and I had no desire to bike alone for a very long time. It was traumatizing to go from such a sense of elation to feeling so vulnerable and small in less than a minute. I shuddered to think of what might have happened had we not understood the potential danger and acted so quickly. Story 2. In 2017, my husband and I were working with a real estate agent to search for our first home. We had already toured quite a few homes, but none of them had been a good fit so far. On a Saturday in late spring, we had lined up 3 very promising home tours, hopeful that at the end of the day we would find one to call home. The first home tour went without a hitch. Nice neighborhood, great layout, but lots of repairs needed. We proceeded to the second home. As soon as we pulled into the driveway, I started to feel generally unwell. I thought perhaps I was coming down with a cold or something and shrugged it off. We followed the real estate agent into the house. Despite large windows and lots of natural lighting, everything just seemed dark and cold. The deeper we walked into the home's interior, the worse I began to feel. We reached the kitchen in the center of the house, and by now I was feeling nauseous. I had never felt this sick so suddenly before, and I was starting to wonder if I would be able to finish the rest of the tour. We made our way into a bedroom next. The real estate agent made a point to show off the walk-in closet. My husband stepped inside the closet and pulled the chain to turn on the overhead light. Instantly, there was a loud pop and flash as the light bulb went out. My husband looked up at me, his eyes quickly fixating on something just behind me as the color drained from his face. I turned to look, but saw nothing aside from the real estate agent in the doorway. I turned back to my husband with a questioning look. He shook his head dismissively and whispered, "Tell you later." After this, we made our way into the basement. As I made my way down the stairs, I began to feel the worst I had felt since arriving at the house. The air felt thick and heavy, and it was hard to breathe. The real estate agent was talking and gesturing to various features of the basement, but I couldn't comprehend a word he was saying. My limbs began to feel weak, and I was sure I was going to faint. I excused myself, saying I needed some air, and went to sit on the porch. My husband followed a few seconds behind. The real estate agent locked up the house and asked if we'd like to see the garage before we left. We both politely declined, stating we didn't feel the house was a good fit for us. The three of us piled into our respective cars and left for the last home on the tour. By the time we reached the end of the street, I felt completely fine, as if none of the ill effects I had experienced in the house had ever happened. On the drive to the next home, my husband told me that after the light bulb in the closet went out, he had looked up to see a very angry older man in glasses standing directly behind me, only to disappear as quickly as he appeared. He hadn't wanted to alarm me or sound crazy in front of the real estate agent, so he kept it to himself until we were alone. The next house on our tour went well, and we returned home to consider our options. The following day, my husband called me during his lunch break at work. He had been discussing the house we toured with a close friend. The friend recognized the house and told him it belonged to a family friend who had recently passed away. He showed my husband the man's picture, and it was the same man my husband saw in the house, distinctive glasses and all. Apparently, he was very proud of his home and strict about how it was maintained. My husband's friend mentioned that the day the man passed, he hadn't been feeling well. He was nauseous, out of breath, and felt a heaviness in his chest. He shrugged it off and went out to his garage to work on his project car. It was there that he had a heart attack and passed away. I am so glad we declined the real estate agent's offer to tour the garage. I had never before experienced anything like this touring a home, and to this day have not experienced anything like it since. Story 3. It was Christmas Day 2022, and I was visiting my dad. He lives in a renovated farmhouse from the late 19th century and enjoys hosting family and friends. He had been living in this house for around 15 years at this point, and I had a lot of wonderful memories growing up here. The gathering that day consisted of about 20 people, with adults conversing around a large table in the dining room and kids playing in an adjacent room. I was listening to a relative's story when my attention was drawn to an eruption of noise coming from the staircase. 2 young boys, around 6 to 8 years old, had run down the stairs, clad in striped pajamas, playing with what looked to be a wooden plane, making plane noises and running with the toy above their heads. I looked up at them, confused, as I didn't recognize the boys, and the kids had been asked not to play upstairs. They looked up at me with the same stunned look I imagine I must have had on my face, as if they had just noticed me and I wasn't supposed to be there. All of this happened in a split second, and then they just disappeared. Wordlessly, I scanned my eyes around the table to see if anyone else had noticed what just occurred. Everyone was carrying on the conversation as if nothing had happened, aside from my husband, who looked up at me equally stunned. We didn't say a word about it until we left the gathering that night and were able to confirm each other's accounts, down to the striped pajamas the boys were wearing. 2 little boys rushing down the stairs with a wooden plane, gleefully running about with all the excitement of Christmas morning. I still have a lot of questions about this incident. Why is it that my husband and I saw and heard the boys, but no one else did? Why did I see something that day, but never another time during the 15 years I had been in that home? But what I'd most like to know is why did they react as if they could see me, as if they'd seen a ghost themselves? Story 4. I grew up in a home that had been in my family for decades, the same home my dad grew up in. My family purchased it from my grandparents, and we moved in when I was around 6 years old. Despite my dad and grandparents never having any strange experiences, we experienced a lot of strange things in that house over the next 10 years. It started with an uneasy feeling in certain parts of the house. My siblings and I were always very nervous about being alone in the laundry room. We always felt like we were being watched. The bedroom that housed the attic entry felt equally eerie, and we avoided going near the attic door at all costs in our younger years. This same bedroom ended up being my younger siblings' room for the majority of our time there. On occasion, I would take my sleeping bag to their room, and we would have a camp-out in their room. It was always a blast, until it was time for lights out. Looking out onto the landing from the center of the bedroom, there would often be the shape of a man in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat staring in at us. He was completely dark, as if made entirely of shadow, with the only distinguishable feature being his bright red eyes. I would lie in my sleeping bag with my eyes squeezed tightly shut, hoping he would go away. I managed to convince myself it must have been a shadow cast by something in the hallway, but there was never anything in the hallway that could have cast a shadow so large. As my siblings and I grew older, we became less afraid of the attic and decided it would make a fun secret hideout. The attic was long and narrow, and despite our newfound bravery, we could never bring ourselves to venture all the way to the back of the attic to make full use of the space. We stayed up front as close to the door as possible in case we needed to make a quick escape. We didn't spend much time in the attic, but when we did, we would see a shadow in the back corner. This was not a stationary shadow either. It would move slowly and carefully around the back wall of the attic, seemingly watching from behind boxes. We never had problems with pests, but this shadow was much too large to be from something like that, its movements too jerky and disjointed. Our secret hideout did not last very long. We all experienced hearing our name being called by a specific person, usually our mom, only to find her and be told she had not been calling for us. This happened at least a couple of times each week. None of us can recall having a similar experience since moving out of that house. We never talked about any of these occurrences until several years after moving out. We had all convinced ourselves we were imagining things or dealing with typical childhood fears, and never brought it up out of embarrassment. One day, a few years back, the TV was on at a family gathering, playing some cheesy horror film. On the screen was a dark, shadowy figure that appeared to be wearing a long coat and wide-brimmed hat with glowing white eyes. My sister started laughing and said, "That looks like what I used to think I saw in my room at the old house." I replied, "Except it had red eyes." The laughter stopped, and the room got really quiet. It was that moment that we realized we had all experienced the same unsettling encounters. Fast forward a couple of years later, my husband and I had just started searching for our first home. I started thinking about our old house and decided to drive by for old time's sake. That's when the dreams started. About a week later, I started to have recurring dreams that my husband and I bought the home, and while cleaning out the attic, we found a box containing an old doll. Every night, the doll would cry and beg for us to dig beneath the basement floor. The doll's pleas became more and more insistent until we dug up the floor to discover a human skeleton. I had this dream on and off for weeks until our home search was over. Then the dream stopped and never happened again. It was the strangest thing I have ever experienced and left me with a lot of questions about what was really in my childhood home. Story 5. As teenagers, my best friend and I lived right down the road from each other in a small suburban neighborhood and walked to each other's homes constantly. One summer night, we decided to have a sleepover complete with junk food, video games, music, and a spa night. After a few hours of being at her house, I realized I had left one of the face masks we planned to use at home. I decided to walk the short distance home and retrieve it. The sun had almost completely set, casting an eerie red glow over the dark and quiet streets. I had walked down the road past a couple of houses when I stepped under the first street light. As soon as I was beneath it, the light went out. I jumped in shock and laughed at myself for being so easily startled. I chalked it up to a weird coincidence and continued my walk. I passed a couple more houses and found myself beneath another streetlight. Again, the light went out as soon as I set foot in its glow. It felt stranger this time and less coincidental. The streetlights were on a timer and were not equipped with motion sensors. I picked up my pace a little. I reached the third streetlight, passed underneath it, and sure enough, it went out too. At this point, I was almost home and bolted toward my house. The last two streetlights did the same thing, and by the time I reached my house, I was completely out of breath. I burst through the door, panting, and my concerned parents asked what had happened. I explained, and they were just as confused as I was, and could not offer any comforting explanation. I was terrified and refused to walk back on my own, even though it was so close. Not sure what to make of it, but seeing how freaked out I was, my parents gave me a ride back to my friend's house, and the rest of the night continued as usual. It was one of the most bizarre things I have ever experienced, and I still have no explanation for it. Story 6. I used to deliver newspapers in my early college years. As a young woman driving quiet roads in the early hours of the morning, it could be extremely unsettling. I had some terrifying moments, like the time I tossed a paper onto a customer's porch, only to be greeted by something running at me from the shadows. I screamed and ran the opposite direction. Thankfully, it turned out to be nothing more than a black cat. Sorry, neighborhood. Another time, while delivering a paper to a farmhouse, I reached out of my car window to place a paper in a customer's box, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a face staring back at me from beside the paper box. I screamed. The thing next to the paper box bolted through an open field, and I realized it was only a deer. How my approaching car didn't scare him off, I'll never know. There was one truly scary incident that happened on my route, however. It was late September, and for the past few weeks, I had noticed a car driving really slowly through a particular neighborhood around 2 a.m. It was usually a street over from me, so I never felt it was a real threat, but paid close attention to my surroundings as a precaution. This neighborhood was just outside city limits, so while not rural, it was much quieter than other neighborhoods I delivered to. One night, I was delivering papers in this neighborhood at the usual time, and the slow-moving car was nowhere to be seen. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued stuffing paper boxes as I made my way through the neighborhood. I arrived at one of the last homes in the neighborhood, the owners of which had requested to have their paper delivered directly to their door. Without a second thought, I unlocked my door and put my hand on the door handle to exit the vehicle. Just as I was about to open the door, something caught my eye. I stared, squinted, trying to bring it into focus. It couldn't be, but it was. I locked my doors in a panic and thought about what to do, still not quite believing what my eyes were seeing. There in the yard, just to the right of the house, was a tall man standing still as could be. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. He was almost invisible in the dark, except for a small piece of reflective material on the shoulder of his jacket. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. There was no way I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. I decided to use my car's brights to get a better look at the man. I counted to 3, preparing to flee the minute I confirmed he was really there, and flicked the lights on. There, on the lawn, staring back at me, was a scarecrow. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding in, and nervous laughter escaped me. Just moments ago, I had been sure someone was silently waiting for me to get out of the car to ambush me on my way to the front door. Unbeknownst to me, the city had decided to expand their annual scarecrow contest outside city limits for the first time in order to include the newer neighborhoods. While there was ultimately no threat, I cannot describe the terror of being sure there was a killer waiting for me out on the lawn that night. Story 7. The Disappearance of Stephen Kubacki. In the winter of 1978, Stephen Kubacki was a 23-year-old history major in his senior year at Hope College, a small private college located in Holland, Michigan. On February 19th, he set out on a cross-country skiing trip over the icy surface of nearby Lake Michigan, a trip from which he did not return. When his roommates had neither seen nor heard from him by nightfall, he was reported missing to local police. A massive search and rescue effort was launched, and his skis and backpack were soon discovered abandoned on the beach. A further search of the area produced a trail of footprints that appeared to come to an abrupt end in the middle of the lake. The authorities could find no trace of Kubacki, and he was presumed to have fallen through the ice and drowned. A memorial service was held for Kubacki at Hope College, and his grieving family did their best to move forward in the wake of the tragedy. 15 months later, on May 5th, 1979, his family was stunned when he suddenly reappeared on his aunt's doorstep in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, more than 700 miles away from where he disappeared. Kubacki told his family he had woken up in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 20 miles from his aunt's home, with no memory of what had occurred. In a rare 1979 interview with the Benton Courier, Kubacki stated, "I didn't know where I was. I was wearing clothes that weren't mine. I started going through a pack which I assumed was mine, and I found maps. I would guess I was hitchhiking. I didn't know what the date was until I walked into town and got a newspaper. In regards to his memory loss, he said, "The only thing I can think of is what mountain climbers suffer from loss of body heat and exhaustion. That combination can result in a temporary loss of memory. I have some really vague feelings. I have some running shoes. I feel like I've done a lot of running. I also have a marathon t-shirt from Wisconsin. I don't know how I got it." Kubaki also denied being in a vulnerable mental or emotional state at the time of his disappearance. "My father was going to sign over our house to me. I had 3 courses at school and no trouble. I left a romance in Germany. There was no trouble with girls. I had a job lined up with the Holland Sentinel," he said. While Kubaki himself could not explain what had happened to him, the media and the public emerged with various theories of their own. Despite his denials, many suspected that Kubaki engineered his own disappearance to escape troubles in his personal life. Others theorized that he may have gotten caught up in local gang or cult activity, explaining his lengthy absence and unwillingness to discuss what occurred during that time period. A number of theories attributed his disappearance to paranormal involvement. Some stated that Bigfoot-like creatures were known to roam the area and had been suspected of kidnapping people and other disappearances. Others believed alien abduction was a valid explanation, as the surrounding area was abundant in UFO sightings. This disappearance has been talked about for decades, even being referenced on the History Channel series Ancient Aliens in 2018. The episode, titled Earth's Black Holes, discusses the possibility of the existence of black holes around the globe and suggests that perhaps Kubaki had inadvertently wandered through one, only to end up in Massachusetts over a year later. Such theories have swirled for decades with no hope of an answer in sight. However, it now appears that we may be close to answering the mystery once and for all. At the time of this video in September 2024, Stephen Kubaki's website touts an upcoming book detailing the untold story behind his disappearance. A statement on his website reads, "After almost 45 years of silence, Stephen Kubaki is ready to reveal where he went after he disappeared. His experience is much stranger and also much more believable than anyone suspects. The story involves a revolutionary organization, an idealistic terrorist in training named Nathan T. Stanfield, spiritual experiences with hallucinogenic drugs and alternate realities, the French Foreign Legion, and a young man's struggle to find meaning during a turbulent time. There are currently no details listed in regards to a publication time. We will stay tuned for updates." Story 8, The Watchers, submitted by an anonymous listener. The summer of 1998 was dry, the air thick with the smell of dust and scorched earth. Samuel had returned to his grandfather's old ranch, tucked away in a remote stretch of New Mexico desert, hoping for solitude. His grandfather had died the previous winter, and though Samuel barely knew the man, the ranch had become his inheritance. Something about the emptiness of the place called to him, a yearning to escape, to reconnect with something lost. The ranch, weather-beaten and frail, clung to the landscape like an ancient, forgotten relic. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, always avoiding the mention of the place. When Samuel asked about the ranch during a stop in town, the cashier only shook her head and muttered, "Some places are better left alone." He had dismissed it then as superstitious nonsense. On his first night, a lonely wind moaned across the sands, carrying with it a low hum, a sound so faint it was easy to mistake for his own mind playing tricks. As he unpacked, the hum followed him. It was barely there, almost inaudible, but enough to create a deep sense of unease. Around midnight, Samuel sat on the porch, sipping whiskey and staring at the horizon, when he noticed it. Movement, subtle and deliberate, At first, he reasoned, it could have been the sway of bushes in the wind, or the dart of a nocturnal animal. But as he squinted, the shapes grew clearer. Figures low to the ground, slinking in the dark. Coyotes, he thought, except these moved differently, too smoothly, too quickly. And there were too many. A chill crept up his spine as the forms circled in the distance, staying just outside the ring of light cast by the porch lamp. The next few nights, the figures grew bolder, edging closer. The ranch had become suffocating, the air too still, too heavy. Samuel's sleep turned restless, broken by dreams of being hunted. In the mornings, he would find fresh tracks in the dirt, though not those of any animal he could recognize. Long, deep impressions that resembled both paw prints and human hands. He tried telling himself it was a trick of the light, a misinterpretation of what he'd seen, but the tracks were undeniable. By the 5th day, the whispers began. They started softly, in a language Samuel couldn't understand. He'd hear them constantly throughout the day, breaking his concentration as he carried out his tasks. Sometimes he'd step outside to find the whispers growing louder, always out of reach, carried on the wind from the far side of the desert. But it was the shadows, those slithering, inhuman shapes, that unnerved him most. One night, driven by frustration and sleeplessness, he ventured beyond the ranch's fence, a flashlight in one hand, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but what he found was worse. About half a mile from the house, the whispers surged, louder now, closer, and then the flashlight flickered. The beam caught something at the edge of its light, a figure. It was crouched low, its back turned, too still to be natural. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he raised the light higher. Slowly, the figure stood, its movement unnatural, jerky, as if its joints didn't fit together properly. When it turned to face him, Samuel's blood ran cold. It looked like a man, but the skin was wrong, stretched too tight over its bones, its face elongated, like someone had tried to copy a human, but had forgotten the details. Its eyes were deep hollows, empty, yet they followed his every move. Samuel stumbled backwards, raising his rifle, but the thing didn't react. Instead, it began to whisper, a rasping, guttural sound that echoed in Samuel's mind more than his ears. The words were foreign, alien, but their intent was clear. You do not belong here. The figure moved toward him, its gait disjointed, and as it did, more emerged from the shadows. Each one was worse than the last. Twisted, malformed versions of humanity, wearing the skins of something that had once been alive, but was no longer human. Panicked, Samuel fired. The sound shattered the stillness, but the creatures didn't stop. Instead, they moved in unison, quicker now, as though the shot had only provoked them. Samuel turned and ran, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his head until he could barely think. He reached the house and slammed the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. Outside, the whispers surrounded the house, circling it like vultures. The shadows moved in the dark, just out of sight, but Samuel could feel their eyes on him, hear their voices. They were watching, always watching. For the rest of the night, he sat by the window, rifle in hand, as the creatures prowled outside. By dawn, they were gone, leaving only silence in their wake. But the fear lingered, and Samuel knew, deep down, that they would return. He didn't last much longer after that. The whispers never stopped, and the figures never strayed far from the house. They were watching, patiently waiting for him to slip. On his final night, Samuel left a single note on the kitchen table before walking out into the desert, flashlight in hand. The note read only, "They wear our skin, but they are not us." He was never seen again. Thank you for joining me for the first episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more tales whispered only in the shadows. If you would like to submit a terrifying tale of your own, head to our subreddit r/thedreadweaver or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.